Hello, everybody. It's Vasi Papadopoulos, and we have a new episode of The Future of Podcast. Today, I'm here with my lovely co-host, Azam, and
Hello.
we've got a... Hello. How are you, actually? We should chat. How's everything going?
I'm good. It's been a while. It's actually only the second or third episode we're doing together. We've done a lot of solos this year, so...
Yeah, we've had... you and I have had the challenge of sort of living on two different continents and having to coordinate our time zones and our schedules. So, but the two of us are really happy to be here today. We've got a very interesting topic, and I think it's a topic where people will, maybe you don't really understand what polling is, but we live with it daily and we read about it all the time in the media. And so our focus really today is we have the Vice President of Ipsos Canada, Gregory Jack, and we'll be focusing on the future of polling. So today we have Gregory Jack, Vice President of Ipsos Canada. He has a long career with Ipsos. He has a background also in government relations, communications. He works with several clients through Ipsos and has a really strong background in working with government, especially the federal government. And for me, I've known him for a long time and I know him really well. He's sort of the data man, the jack of all information, where you can really get a sense of the pulse of what's going on both in Canada and on topics globally. So we're really happy to have him here today. Our focus, like I said at the beginning, is really going to be to talk about the future of polling. So Greg, welcome to the program today. How are you?
I'm great. Good morning, and thank you both for having me. And thanks for that great introduction. I'm really happy to be here and talking about something that I think is really quite important, as you say, is the future of polling and research and what that means for society and people who really see these things every day in their lives in the media and that sort of thing. So thanks again for having me.
Great. So why don't we start and maybe I know I did a little bit of an introduction about you, but how about you tell us maybe a bit about your background, how you got into this space, and why you think the topic of polling actually to start off is important. And then maybe I think for our listeners, the most important thing in layman's terms, if you can really explain what this idea or notion of polling is. I think that's a really good place to start.
Sure, that's great. And my background, as you pointed out, is diverse. I spent a lot of my time when I started working in government. One of the things I was responsible in government for was public opinion research. So I was in the communications public opinion research space, or the public affairs space, as it were. I did do a couple of years working as a lobbyist, and I'd known the president of Ipsos Public Affairs Canada, Mike College, from my earlier days in government, and called me up one day and had an opportunity to join Ipsos in Calgary as VP of Public Affairs. So I took it, and I've been with Ipsos since 2019. So as you say, lots of clients. Uvasi, of course, are one of them. Really enjoyed working with you on some of our projects, and Ipsos is a great place to work because we're a huge company. We're in 90 countries. 18,000 employees worldwide. And so there's tremendous opportunity to work on a whole bunch of different topics and issues, and the possibilities are really endless. But as you said, we're a market research company. And one of the main things that we do is polling. We ask people's opinions about various things. I think we've lost Vasi.
Yeah, I mean, you can keep going. That's fine. We'll come back. She'll come back.
Okay. So one of the things we do is we ask people about their opinions of various things, using polls. And, the dictionary defines polling as, a study where you're asking people for their opinions about a subject or a person. But I think that's a little bit narrow. And the best definition that I can think of is sort of the systemic gathering of people's opinions, intentions, and beliefs that we use to detect trends and predict behavior. And when we conduct a poll, we set out to figure out what a certain subset of the population thinks. So that subset might be, the Canadian population or the European population. It also might be something super specific, such as, single mothers with school-aged children living in southern France. And when what we do is we poll them based on demographic profiles, and we collect a sample. And of course, so you'll often see things like, sample of 1,000 or sample of 2,000. And that's because it's really impossible to talk to everyone. So what we'll do is we'll collect a sample of the population, and you'll see something called a margin of error or a confidence interval. That's basically telling you how accurate that sample is. And the more people we ask, the more confident we are in the results. So this is basically due to something called the law of large numbers, which states essentially that as a sample size grows, we get closer to the average of the whole population. And so we can use a sample of the population to essentially predict or speak for what the population as a whole thinks or believes. And of course, there's another meaning to the word poll. It's when we go to vote. And in that case, we actually do ask the entire population for their opinion, even if they don't all exercise that right. And so there's no margin of error or confidence interval in an election poll. But one of the things that we do in my industry in polling is we try and take a poll of the electorate as to where they're going to vote or who they're going to vote for and why. And that's using sample sizes. So these days, we're doing most of our polling online. But traditionally, it was done through telephone. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've gotten here today and what this means, the shift from telephone to online, some of the challenges. And then, of course, as you guys said, the future of polling and what it's going to mean going forward. There's still room for telephone polling in the industry, but increasingly a lot of it is done online and all that. And the last thing I would say, polling is a science. Obviously, we're applying statistical methodology to this. There's all kinds of probability sampling that goes into deciding how we collect that sample. But of course, it's also an art, right? The questionnaire design itself can influence the question. Even the order we ask the questions in can influence the answers, or what time of day somebody completes the poll. So we have a lot of methodologies and things to do to control for that bias. But polling is both a science and an art. And it's really the only scientific way we have right now, as flawed as it might be, to gather the opinions and beliefs of a broad population using sampling.
Thank you. And so let's talk a little bit about the process. So you mentioned, a lot of what you do today is online. Telephone's still quite relevant. So let's say you decide to poll on one particular topic, subject. How do you go about doing it? What's involved?
Well, we'll talk to our client, or we'll talk to whoever wants to do the research. We'll figure out, first of all, who the target population is. So as I said earlier, your target population might be all Canadians or all Europeans, or whatever the case may be, or it might be very specific, like single mothers in southern France with school-age children. And then what we'll do is we'll figure out the data collection methodology. So as I mentioned earlier, quite frequently now that's online. We have panels of people who have signed up to complete the polls. And so that is a representative sample, but that's not a random sample. And that's a critical difference between when we used to do telephone polling and even door-to-door, face-to-face polling. That was a random sample. Online polling is not yet random. Now, we are working on methodologies for that, and that's part of the future of polling. But once we decide on the sample collection methodology, whether it's telephone or online or something else, I'll design a questionnaire. I'll work with my client or whoever wants to conduct the research to figure out the right questions to ask. And that's the art part of it, right? Figuring out how to get at the information that we want to get at. And then we'll put the poll into the field. We'll either do it through our online panels, or we'll have live telephone operators that will talk to people personally. There are some firms, not Ipsos, but some firms use automated dialing and robotic data collection. So the person's on the phone, but they're talking to a computer. We don't use that because we don't find it's very effective, but it is another method used. In any case, once all that is done, we'll get the data back. We'll take a look at the data. We'll apply some weights to make sure that it's actually representative of the population based on census data and what we know. For example, online polling tends to deliver a higher level of younger respondents, which is not surprising. Over time, that's going to change as people who have been online all the time become older. And telephone polls, and landline specifically, tends to deliver an older type of the population. So we'll take a look at the data. We'll do some quality control on the data to make sure that it's actually reflective of the population. And then we'll analyze the data. I'll take a look at the responses. I might do top-line results, for example, looking at the frequencies of certain questions, or I might do some more advanced statistical analysis like multiple regression, factor analysis, these sorts of things, to really unpack the data and get at the meaning behind it. And one of the things that I find most fascinating about this job and being a market researcher is that interpretation part of it. Looking into the data and getting a sense of what is it telling us, what can we predict based on the results, what does it tell us about people's beliefs, behaviors, future, and that sort of thing. And that's one of the biggest things that has changed in polling since the last 20 years. Previously, collecting data and doing a poll was a commodity. So you had to pay a company like Ipsos to go out and do that poll. There was really no other way for you to get the information. Now, it's not. You can go out and you can sign on to a platform like Google, and you can do your own poll. You can collect the data on your own. And that's one of the many things that has changed because of the internet. And so data collection is no longer the commodity, but there's piles and piles and piles of data out there. One of our biggest clients is actually Google, because they have all kinds of data, but the analysis and interpretation of those data is really important and really critical. And so I really enjoy that part of the job because it's sifting through the data and trying to find meaning in numbers. And so in the example I was giving, if I went out and I did a poll for a client and we had the data back, I would go through those data to figure out what some of the trends are and maybe what some of the things that I could advise the client to do on the basis of that data. And increasingly, and we're going to talk a little bit later, I'm sure, about the future of polling, the data collection part is really less and less the important thing. And it's really that understanding of data, because data are everywhere, right? I like to joke that your phone probably knows more about you than you do. And there's all kinds of stuff happening online that can be captured and analyzed in data form to understand and predict people's behavior. And that's essentially what we're up to here, whether it's running a telephone poll, an online poll, or taking a look at trends and other things that we find just in everyday life.
So based on what you said, I've got two streams or two streams of thoughts or two streams of questions. And so one is, I think at the beginning I had mentioned polling seems to be everywhere, or information or data. Maybe you can explain a bit more as to, or maybe I missed it, why it's important. Like, why is it important that we look at these things as a society on a consistent basis, as well as moving forward? Sure. And I think the second part that I'm hearing, and this is where I'm interested in, is data used to be the commodity, as you said. It isn't anymore. Is there almost too much data now? Because when we talk about data, to your point, I basically hand over my life when I sign on to social media. So that people know you and know all about you, whether you like it or not. And so, how much of that can you take and analyze it in a way that makes sense? Because sometimes there's just all this information, and is it useful or is it not useful?
Yeah, and those are both great questions, and I'll go through them, in the order you asked. But the first one, of course, why is polling important? Well, frankly, it's the only accurate scientific way to measure public opinion that we have. Everything else is pretty approximate. Polls aren't perfect, and I'm not saying that they are, but they're much better than the alternatives. And so if we don't have reputable polling firms giving those transparent and science-based methodologies, we're not going to get some idealistic poll-free world. What we're going to get are tons of shady numbers circulating with no means of checking their accuracy, which is a lot worse, even if you think polling should be constrained. So companies like mine, and there's lots of really good reputable companies out there we belong to an organization that ensures that our research is methodological, that it's scientifically based, that it meets certain standards. Privacy is another one. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And so, polls give us a snapshot of society, and they're the best method we have right now to get that snapshot. There's other research methodologies as well, like focus groups, which I'm sure your listeners have heard about. And those qualitative measures that also are really useful for research tools. But a poll is the only quantitative way that we have to collect opinion about people, what they believe, and how they're going to vote. That is scientifically based and reliable and can be tested. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about some of the evolution in polling over the last few years, and some of the big misses that some firms have had on some elections. The Trump election being the one that comes to mind, but there's been others, and certainly that's a risk. But at the same time, I think that polls help to inform the electorate. They get them thinking about things. They get them thinking about elections. They provide a bit of a narrative to the media during an election campaign, or even on a particular issue, whether that issue is healthcare, climate change, COVID-19, that sort of thing, to collect what people think. And that informs governments, that informs businesses, that informs decision-making in a really valuable way. Without it, you're essentially guessing. And so that's why I think polling is really important.
And it's almost sort of like when you're developing a product or you're getting feedback for something maybe that you've bought. This is sort of the public version of feedback, essentially. Sure. It's like, where are people? Where is the pulse of this discussion? Where are we heading as a society? And I think, to your point, it's the only way where we can publicly use a methodology where we can gauge, okay, here's where we're at in the grand history of, let's say, in this case, 2022.
So I have a two-part question about this. So one, and this is something that's always fascinated me, because over time we've seen a lot of polls that have been accurate as well. So, yes, everyone remembers the 2016 US elections, but obviously a lot of times, polls have got things right as well. The first is, when you reach out to your target audience, what's the incentive for them to give you an accurate answer? How do you discern the accuracy of those answers?
Right.
So, for example, if someone calls me, okay, online it's a little bit different because I'm not interacting with the person, but if someone calls me and asks me questions, I really have no incentive to give them the right answer, maybe what they want to hear, especially in polarizing times where you feel that, some ideas are not popular, good or bad, that's not the argument. But if they're not, and you don't want to discuss it, you'll probably not you won't give an accurate answer, right? You don't want to put yourself out there. So do you ever see where, let's say, when you do a poll, the responses are different than maybe if you cross-reference them from Google searches, for example? So that's the first part. Mm-hmm. And the second part is, a lot of times polls are also a snapshot in time.
Yes.
But those polls then get referenced for a number of years when they may not be as accurate, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do people, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. And you guys got a lot of two-part questions here. I'll talk a bit about the first piece, which is, essentially the accuracy of answers. And then sort of how polling is used. And I want to talk a bit later about the role of the media in that, and the responsibility, I think, that the media and other folks have of reporting this stuff, accurately. But, you're quite right that sometimes people, they fall into a bias of wanting to maybe tell us what we want to hear. And that's one of the things that we ran into in the industry in the election of Trump in 2016. A lot of people didn't want to admit they were voting for Donald Trump, but they were. But it was sort of socially unacceptable. We run into this on all kinds of issues, from asking people, how much do you drink per day, to do you smoke, all of these different things. And the way that we get around that essentially is two ways. One, people tend to tell the truth. And with a large sample, unless you give them incentive to lie, most people are going to tell the truth in these polls, especially on telephone when you're talking to a real human being. It's a little more tricky online because there's nothing to stop me from saying that I'm a 65-year-old female, and you can't be proven online. But on the telephone, people tend to be a little more honest because they're talking to an actual person. But the second thing we do is we do tests for this, right? We have all kinds of methods that we use to make sure that we're avoiding selection bias. When we ask tricky questions like, do you smoke, or how many drinks do you have per day, we have a baseline that we can essentially weight those data down to. We bell curve the data. And we are cognizant of this kind of bias in some answers. There's a whole section of my industry and a whole section of my company that deals in something called behavioral sciences. And so there's a number of questions that we'll ask people that'll generate essentially an index. So instead of saying to Vasi, how many drinks do you have per day? We might ask about general behaviors like, how many times do you go to the pub and that sort of thing. And we can derive the answer from there. And it's, when we look at the future of polling, this is becoming more and more useful because we can collect data based on how people behave instead of asking them how they behave. So one of the things that was done during COVID, for example, is cell phone signals were used to estimate certain things. And the Government of Canada admitted they did this. Your cell phone is putting out its location all the time, even if you've turned off location services, I believe, because it's got to connect with the tower. So instead of asking... You can actually, if you go into airplane mode, you can still use your maps on your phone. So your phone, regardless of if it's on or not, you can track yourself regardless. Yeah. Exactly. And so during COVID, right, governments and others used cell phone data to figure out the wait time for shots. Instead of asking people, how long did you wait for your shot? You can use this for banks if you wanted to figure out the average time somebody is in a bank, right? If you're TD Bank. And there's all kinds of ways that these data are being used. So to my mind, and this is less of a question about the future of polling, but more about the future of market research and understanding data. This data scraping is going to become increasingly important because, as you rightly point out, there are biases when you ask people about things, especially sensitive topics like voting or behavior. But on the voting question, for example, we know that we are overestimating the number of people who say they're going to vote Conservative if we do a telephone poll. We know that some candidates and some types of parties, people don't want to admit that they're going to vote for them. And so, we adjust our findings using weights and metrics to fix that. But it's obviously, as you point out, it is an ongoing concern. And I do think that over the last number of years, and this is more a sociological comment, people have become more suspicious of any of these things that ask them to provide personal information like a poll. And we've seen this in there was a book in 1992 called The Decline of Deference, which was essentially about data collection and polling and how people are less likely now to defer to authority. If you ran a poll in 1970, say, on Gallup, I would have much less concern that people are going to lie. Why would they lie, right? You don't lie because there was a little bit of a social norm that said that you would tell the truth. I think that has generally declined over the last 30, 40, or 50 years. And so it is increasingly a problem. And it's one of the challenges that not only my industry is facing, but I think governments are facing, businesses are facing, and all of us are facing, even in our interpersonal relationships. So that's a bit of a more broad answer maybe than you were looking for, but I think it's a broader social trend than just restricted to polling. Now, what was the second question again?
Well, excuse me. The second part was more about polls being a snapshot in time.
Right.
But then they get referenced. So one example I always have is after 9/11, obviously a lot of things changed, right? I mean, there was maybe a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment in certain parts of the world, but even in, let's say, the Muslim part of the world, there was an anti-US sentiment with the invasion of Iraq, especially, and things like that.
Sure.
There was a Pew research that there was a Pew poll that went out at that time, and it was done in Muslim countries. Was a bit anti-American. I don't remember the exact details, but that got referenced like for 10 years on media.
Yeah.
And, when people formulating responses around that, like, how do you work with that? Like, I mean, where's the responsibility, let's say, for media comes in, or even for poll companies to update? I don't know. So
I think it's a tremendously important point. And I mentioned earlier how important questionnaire design is in making sure that we're not asking biased questions. That's really important. And, there's something called a push poll out there where you ask a question in a manner in which it's designed to get a certain answer. Some polling firms, are engaging in that behavior. But also, if somebody does their own poll, they might not have, training or background in writing questionnaires, so they might accidentally put a push poll out. So that's the first piece.
And what would be an example of that? Let's say a push poll question.
For example, as you know, climate change is being caused by Canada's oil and natural gas industry polluting the environment and putting our environment at risk. Given this, how important is it that Canada shut down the oil and natural gas industry? Well, I've just given one point of view. Scales are important too. If you ever see a scale that says strongly agree, somewhat agree, disagree, it's an unbalanced scale. So these are all ways that you can manipulate the questions. But the point you make about the media and making sure that people realize the limitations of the tool is equally important. You're quite right. These are snapshots in time. And one of the things that we find happens, especially on election polling, is, we'll come out with a poll a couple of days before the vote, and then it will change. And people say, well, the pollsters were wrong. And I say, well, I don't know that we were wrong. We might have been, or people might have changed their mind when they got to the voting booth, or something might have happened that altered who they were going to vote for in the intervening days between when we did the poll and when the vote was. And I believe in Canada, for sure, there's a certain prohibition on releasing polls too close to the actual vote, so we don't bias it. But that means there is that snapshot in time. One way to account for this is averaging, right? When we can look at a poll, take for example, a topic over a long period. You can average out the scores or the metrics to make sure that you're not accidentally reporting on one of the snapshots that maybe was happening at a particularly sensitive period. There was something in the media. That 19 times out of 20 when our sample isn't actually representative, and we just purely by chance happen to get only people who vote conservative, for example. So we're always on the lookout for that. But the media has a big responsibility too. And one of the things that I find the media does is they take some of our results and they'll report them as if this is just the way it is. So things like, Canadians believe in climate change. Well, that's true. They do. The majority of them do. But there's nuances in there. Not everybody necessarily believes in it. The majority does. Over time, that number has gone up. I do a lot of work in the energy and environment space, and so this is why I keep returning to this as an example. And media also have a responsibility to talk about the limitations of that poll. They've got to publish the methodology, for example. They've got to make sure that everybody knows that this is essentially a scientific procedure. And so it's a best hypothesis of where the public is based on that methodological rigor. But it can change tomorrow. And 9/11 is a really good example because I saw a few things happen in the polling world after 9/11 that were quite interesting. First of all, George Bush's approval rating went from like 22 to 96 overnight, right? Was that actually reflective of his approval rating? Probably not. It was more reflective of the country gathering around and having a view that, we've got to support the country and support the president, right? And so if you took that approval rating and you said that was George Bush's approval rating, well, at a particular point in time, it probably was, but it changed. And media have a responsibility, like you say, too, not to report old data. And we do see this often, and even sometimes they'll tell you in a little footnote, 2006 or something. And this is not, obviously reflective of today's views. Some issues can change very rapidly. COVID was a real example of that, where we saw rapid change of people's views on lockdowns, on performance of political leaders, on vaccines, and we had to be in the field very, very frequently. I think we were in the field once a week to make sure that we, as a research organization, had an up-to-date view. And I talked about averaging too, blending some of those samples together so that you can smooth out that trend in a way that stops the big spikes that are maybe driven from external events. So I would say that, understanding what polling is and what it isn't and the limitations, if you're going to use it, if you're going to cite it, that's really important. And that's why I think it's great that you guys are doing this podcast, because I can talk a little bit about that and maybe some people will think about it in a different way.
So why don't we push on that a little bit and maybe get into the role of the media and what that role is when it comes to polling, and sort of the future state of that. So because what I'm hearing is, when polling is very scientific, you gather a lot of data, And when that's the case, you have to read it or analyze it a certain way. And then based on that, it has to be reported in a certain way. And sometimes what I find, because I'll do it, I'll read a headline or I'll read the story. I look at the polling and go, I'm not really sure that's what the polling is actually saying, or that's what the data is saying. So I was wondering if you could maybe touch upon that and what the role of the media is right now, and what it should actually be, future state, and how we sort of protect the integrity of polling and data moving forward.
Well, I think that question has some roots in a completely different question, which is the future of media. And maybe you should do
a little bit,
on that. But just like polling and data collection, where we were the commodity and you had to pay us to collect the data, the media has been decommodified as well. We're doing a podcast right now, which 30 years ago would have been impossible, or even 20 years ago. Anyone can put up a blog or call themselves a journalist. There are standards in the media world, but the support for factual, unbiased media and this sort of phenomenon of fake news and the use of fake news to attack legitimate news has increased. So I think the media, the responsibility that they have, and I'm talking, credible publications here like the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, they have a responsibility to report things factually and an unbiased way, but lack of funding for a lot of these organizations has meant that the experts don't exist anymore, and so you don't necessarily have within a large media organization an expert in something like polling, and that makes it really tricky. So I think that one of the unfortunate results of this is that the user has to use their own judgment and discern whether or not they can can or should believe it. That's why reputation and brand name are really important. And Ipsos, as a large multinational company, we really realize how important that is, because if our name goes next to a poll, people are more likely to believe it. And if we start to diminish that reputation by not doing good work or doing shoddy work, or if our numbers are reported in an inaccurate way, that can damage our credibility going forward. So, in the future for the media, I think that and generally, I think data literacy is becoming more and more important. As I said, data is everywhere, and we have to understand it a lot better in order to live with it and interpret it. That interpretation piece is that piece that you talked about earlier, and I mentioned about some of that expertise, right? Having some expertise and engaging with a professional to interpret the data, just like you would want to engage with a professional journalist when you want to read about the news and not just read, your cousin's blog. So I think that going forward, we're going to see more and more requirements for media to be data literate. And I think that people are going to have to figure out how to do that a little bit more themselves. But the problem, of course, is, in today's world, a snappy headline, a tweet is really all you have time for. And if you look at some of the longer term studies that have been done using polling data, and I mentioned The Decline of Deference, that book was based on the World Value Survey, which was repeated 4 times, I think, over 3 decades. And they literally went door to door with cards and asked people questions. It was a long-term survey. And this was a whole book. You really had to read that whole book to understand the depth of the data collection. You can't cover that in a tweet. I don't know what the answer to that is, except to say, Vasi, as you point out, when the headline says Canadians believe X, it's probably a little bit more nuanced than that. But it's really hard to get that into an article that people will read and understand in the time constraints that we have in a multi-channel universe. So,
yeah, absolutely. I was also wondering, remember I had asked that second question about data? I don't think we covered it. So maybe, do you remember it?
Can you refresh my memory?
Yeah, we can go back and edit it. It was around how remember you had talked about, I'll kind of reset it. So Greg, you had talked about how data used to be a commodity and it isn't anymore. Our phones basically tell more of a story about us than we even want to understand, I believe. And so now with this notion of, polling and it's a scientific method, and you collect all of this data, how much data collection is too much, or how much, data and polling is also too much, and how do you take that type of, because we're inundated now with information, right? I can go out and find all this information, and how do you package it in a way that makes sense moving forward? So when you're doing your analysis and then you present it to, readers or listeners to us, it's valuable, and it makes sense moving forward.
No, I think that's a great question. And, I think I read somewhere that the amount of information in the world is doubling at something like a rate of every 2 or 3 years, right? If you took all of the information and data that we had in the 14th century, it could probably fit on a memory stick. I'm being a little bit facetious, but that exponential growth of data is really, really important. And so, as you rightly point out, the challenge has become figuring out what parts matter and doing that thoughtful analysis and taking a story out of it that is empirically based. Is there too much data? I don't think that's a reasonable question, because there can't be too much. I mean, it exists, and it is or it isn't. But is it essentially overwhelming for people to sift through in ways that it wasn't before? Absolutely. And yeah, you can have too much data in an analysis of something where you essentially become blinded or overrun by contradictory statements and questions. But that's why, as I was saying, I think the importance of experts in these areas is more and more recognized, because what I do now as a pollster is more the interpretation of that data, or at least as much the interpretation of that data as the collection of that data. And 20 or 30 years ago, the collection part took a lot of time and was hard, and now it takes less time and it's easier. But the interpretation and the rigor to make sure that it's accurate is really essential. And I don't know what the necessarily the best way to tell people how to know which data are important and which are not. That's one of the great challenges I think of our time right now, is there's so much of it, and you can go to any corner of the internet or any corner of the web and find arguments and polls that agree with your statement. So that's where I go back to what I was saying before. Take a look at that poll. Were the questions neutral? Was the sample representative? Was it conducted on a platform that was accessible to everyone, or at least was able to get the general population? Is it clear about its methodology? Is it being transparent about its limitations? But it's really asking a lot of people to become experts in that and do that kind of work. So there is I would say an ethical imperative for companies that are presenting results of data like we are, to be upfront and honest about this stuff and follow a certain ethical or moral code, because otherwise you can use you can use polling data really to drive an agenda, and that's one of the questions that you asked earlier as to why polling is important. That's another one. It can really drive an agenda. My boss, when I first got into this business over 20 years ago, said to me, polling is like black magic. You can walk into a room and you've got numbers, you've got data. All of a sudden, we can have a conversation because you've got something that people want to hear about. People are interested in hearing, what does the public think, or what are the numbers on this kind of thing. So as pollsters, we have a responsibility to make sure that we use that in an ethical and moral way to actually tell people what we think is happening in an objective manner. But it is certainly a compelling thing for people when I walk into a conversation and I have numbers or I have data to back it up. All of a sudden, it adds credibility to what I have to say, and
right.
It has to, the numbers themselves have to be credible. Otherwise, I'm really just not really being honest with people if I'm not using credible polling data.
So let's talk a little bit about the politics as well, right? So 2016, like we mentioned earlier, a lot of pollsters got it wrong. So if you don't mind just talking a little bit about why that may have happened. Obviously, we briefly touched a little bit, and what, let's say, as what polling companies would have done differently going forward. But then what happened was even 2020 wasn't very accurate. I mean, I think originally it probably gave a much overstated lead for Joe Biden than it ended up being. Was it because the methodology did not change, or was it because the methodology changed and it overcorrected, or was it there's some other bias in data? What happened between 16 and 20?
Well, I mean, there's been papers written about 2016, and that was, an example where a lot of pollsters sort of maybe got it wrong, as I said earlier. I don't recall 2020 as being as inaccurate. I think that we were all fairly confident of the result, and it turned out to be what mostly happened. There's two things, right? There's the degree of difference, and then there's the right or wrong answer. If I do a political poll, and I say, the NDP is going to win the election, and they win the election, but I'm off by a couple of points. Say I'm off by 5 points. That is seen by the media as worse than if I say the Liberals are going to win the election and the NDP wins, but I'm only off by 1 or 2 points. That thin margin of error, right? And so going back to one of the questions we had before, the media is interested in winners and losers in horse races. And, if you're within the margin of error, which I believe a lot of pollsters in the U.S. were in 2020, it's not an area that I worked on, and I can talk more about Canadian elections, but being within the margin of error, then if they get 1 or 2 seat counts wrong or that kind of thing, that's fine. But if you get the winner wrong, even if you're within the margin of error, that's where people kind of get they feel like you got this wrong, but it wasn't. It was just it was a very, very tight. So methodologically speaking, I think the industry did a few things. One is they recognized that bias that I talked about, where people didn't want to admit they were going to vote for Trump. We see in Canada, we saw some of that. People didn't want to admit they were going to vote for the People's Party last time. So we account for that in some of our analysis. Mixed methodology, so making sure that you're using not only online, but telephone. We do this in all of the Canadian elections, especially when we do what's called the call poll, or the final poll of the campaign. We make sure we have a big sample. We make sure that we use mixed methodology so that we're capturing both online and telephone. We take a strong look at the numbers to ensure that not only are they representative of the population, are they consistent with what other polls are saying. There's a lot of polling aggregation sites like 535 and 338, and what they do is they basically put all the polls about an election together, and different methodologies, different questions. They weight them based on the recency of the poll. Going back to what you said earlier, you don't want to consider a poll that was done 2 weeks ago the same value as one done yesterday. They weight them based on the methodology, whether it's telephone, online, or the other methods that are used, and then the reputation and success of the polling firm. So then you kind of smooth out the differences. And Nate Silver in the States talked a lot about this and about the Trump election in 2016 and some of the things that they've done to make sure that that kind of error doesn't happen again. But I also think that the election in 2016 was to an extent an anomaly, in the sense that it was really a transformational election for the United States. You'd had the Democrats in power for 8 years. You'd had the first Black president in history. You had a woman running for president who had her own history, and you had a very, very willing to do anything populist, who was taking advantage of a point in time and really riling up American anger and that sort of thing. So I don't think that we can look too much to the 2016 election as necessarily the benchmark of political polling. There have been, as one of you guys pointed out earlier, that lots of times where we've been quite right about our predictions. And I think 2020 was one of those times. So just taking into account the context of what's happening and when that poll was done, the snapshot in time is clear at the moment. But even looking back on 2016 now, it is more clear looking back that far, how many things were changing and how different things were in the United States, and all of the different factors that went into Trump's improbable victory, which in retrospect, when you really look at things, wasn't as improbable as we thought at the time. But a lot of people were quite shocked by it because it didn't fit our frame of expectations at that time.
Perfect. So I think we can shift our focus a little bit more towards the future, right? I mean, that's the theme of our podcast. So starting off with that, Greg, if you can talk a little bit about how over the years that you've seen polling evolve. Obviously, telephone and online is one, but overall, how the process has evolved, what are some of the new challenges that you're facing, and what trends or what challenges do you expect to see going forward?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'll briefly talk about the evolution because it's it's not the history of polling. That's a different podcast. Really this sort of methodological approach started around Gallup's time, around 1940, and it wasn't until we had the creation of what's called CATI, computer automated telephone interviewing, where you could dial out a bunch of numbers at the same time and the computer would arrange it, that we started to get really reliable telephone polls that in the 80s and 90s, when it really became a necessary methodological tool, because you could complete a poll in a week that used to take 5-6 weeks, when we literally used to go door to door and hold up the picture, the sign. And so, then in the 2010s, online became very prominent. That has actually made it much more difficult for our industry, because when we had landline telephone polling, you could tell by someone's area code where they lived. I live in Ottawa and I have a Calgary phone number because I've kept it. It's on my cell phone. So it has made it more difficult to geographically isolate people. And that's one of the challenges that we have as an industry, is if you want to do a poll in a very small geographic area, say a small town in Ontario, I'm going to have to rely a little bit more on landline polling, because I need to know that the people I'm phoning are actually from there. So that's one of the challenges. But right now, as I said, we're working on things like better geolocation for online, randomized online samples. There's constant evolution and a lot of very smart people thinking about how this can be done better. Because essentially, what we're talking about is collecting data and information in a methodologically sound way. And so, in the future, one of the things that I think is going to start to happen, and it is happening at Ipsos, is the increased use of artificial intelligence to analyze some of these data. We have an entire division at Ipsos that is actually dedicated to this. And this gets at the point that we were talking about earlier. There's tons and tons of data. How can we use artificial intelligence and computer generated learning to analyze those data in a way that would take a human being days, weeks, or months? We, for example, if you ask an open-ended question, right? What do you think the most important issue facing the world today or the country today is? You can type anything you want in. We have human people who go through those responses and code them. Well, one of the projects I did recently was for a government department who would put one of those things out, and they had like 30,000 open-end responses, and people they could write an entire essay basically about the topic. So you had a massive amount of unstructured, open-ended data, and a human being couldn't go through that reasonably or accurately in a quick enough way to pull out what people are saying. Well, a computer can. And so we have a division, as I said, at Ipsos, and other companies I'm sure are developing this, where they use machine-based learning. They'll take different strings of words. They'll create an algorithm that can basically determine not only what was said, but the tone or the intent of what was said. Was it a negative or a positive comment on what the government is doing, or negative or a positive comment on the product, or anything like that? And so I think that kind of machine-based learning is one of the big things that are going to continue to revolutionize the polling and essentially the market research industry as a whole. And we're getting increasingly good at it. The computer systems and algorithms are becoming increasingly sophisticated. And, if you're a computer engineer, a data engineer now, that's an area where there's going to be a lot of growth, not only in the polling and market research industry, but in industries all over the world. Because of the very point that I mentioned earlier, the large amount of unstructured data that is out there, and that challenge of sorting through it and pulling out the things that matter and discarding the rest.
That's interesting. So that leads me to one question that I always ask. It has less to do with polling, but I mean, I'd like an answer within your field. The sociological impact of using artificial intelligence. So I think at one level, it makes sense. You have such large amount of data. You do need some kind of AI or machine learning to help you sift through it, right?
Yes.
But there's certain industries where you also have to look at what the unintended outcomes or consequences are, right? From a sociological perspective. So for example, let's say in the world of social media, we have social media, we build a public square, but we never thought about a lot of these issues, and we're seeing, some of the challenges coming with it. Is that something that would be of concern in the world of polling, or let's say in the industry of polling? Or because it's mostly still has always been a statistical, methodologically based, and basically it's still a numbers field, that it's less of an issue? Or are there some other ethical questions that you may have to, concern yourself with?
I think there's a couple of answers to that. I mean, unintended consequences is always a concern in any endeavor. And you're quite right. We created, social media was created as this public square, and all of a sudden, all these things problems we didn't have before, we didn't think of, suddenly surfaced. There's a book that I recently read, which I'll probably mention later if we have more questions about what I've been reading. But there's a book I recently read where essentially the author said, or posited this idea that when you invent something, you have to think of the worst possible scenario as the consequence. So whoever invented the automobile had to or should have thought about car accidents. And so as we use artificial intelligence, there's absolutely some things we have to worry about. What if the computer gets it wrong? Or conversely, what if the computer can go through the data and actually learn and predict things about people that for example, their chances of getting cancer or medical areas, and how is that data going to be used, right? If I can use polling data to predict accurately whether you have a healthy lifestyle, and then I sell that to an insurance company, and they use that to make decisions about whether to give you insurance, that's going to be a problem. And so, and this is not about polling as much as it is about how we analyze the data and the power of artificial intelligence to uncover things about us that we might not want others to know. And then the power of companies to use that information against us. I absolutely think there's all kinds of risks around that. And as I said, we have all kinds of technologies and algorithms that can scrape the internet for things that you've said on social media, which never actually disappear. Your browsing history, your phone history, all of these things. What if these computer algorithms become powerful enough to make predictions about you, accurate or not, but predictions about you that can lead people to make decisions that directly affect you in an inversely negative way? And that's why I mentioned earlier, privacy is so very important. And in our work, one of the big things about polling that we always have to promise is that your responses are anonymous, that we're not going to tie this back to you, right? And we take that extremely seriously, because that's part of the trust of filling out the poll. And if you don't think that your responses are anonymous, if you don't think that we're going to if you think we're going to be able to identify you, then you're going to be less likely to be honest. You're going to be less likely to fill out the questionnaire. But I think that going back to your question about the unintended consequences of AI, absolutely, privacy and how the algorithms' information and findings are going to be used are really important. There's right now the ability of artificial intelligence to write newspaper articles, say summarizing a baseball game, and you probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And this goes to the other point that I made. I still think the human interaction, that analyst, that person looking at the data is an essential step. And we still need that. I'm not saying we'll never not need that. I'm not saying that the technology won't advance to the point where what I do isn't really needed to be done by me, because it can be automated. But I think for the time being, the role that I play as a pollster is safe, because you always need that human to look at the data and say, and this is not the scientific part, but it's does this make sense, right? I'm looking at the data. Does this make sense in the broader context of the world that I live in and my expectations? And we do this on our voting polls. We do this on all of the research that we do for clients. If the data says one thing and it doesn't make sense, then I've got an interesting problem to solve. I've either got a bad sample, or I've missed something, or I found something new, and the data, are pointing in a direction that I don't expect. But there isn't a computer right now, I think, that can do that. Does this make sense? Contextual analysis of a data set or of a survey result.
So based on a lot of the data sets that you look at on a regular basis, what would you say would be some of the larger future societal trends that we should be looking at, or that we can anticipate?
Well, I think that one of the things that's happening is we're starting to put a bunch of different data points together in ways that we haven't before. And I will say that right now, we're 2022. Ipsos has a product called What the Future, which is sort of a podcast we put out every now and then on what the future is going to mean for everything from automobiles to self-driving cars, that sort of thing. A few things that I'm seeing in our trends right now, and this is really the interpretation of the data that I've been talking to you about for the last little while. But right now, society is in a pretty precarious place. And I think we might look back on the period between about 1945, the post-war era, to, I would say, September 10th, 2001, as this golden age of, in the 90s, there weren't a lot of wars. It felt like we were going to have massive globalization and all of our problems would be solved. And there was a book by a guy named Jeremy Rifkin in the 90s called The Future of Work, where he talked about automation for everything, and we're going to live lives of leisure and not have to worry about, doing the things that I've just told you computers can't do and probably won't be able to do for a while. But looking back on that time, people were optimistic, and we see now in our data and all of the different survey results that I've been looking at, a very large level of pessimism, a loss of faith in governments and institutions. And even during COVID, we saw governments doing everything they could do for the most part to help keep people afloat. But now, we're struggling with inflation, with rising costs. These aren't problems that governments can just throw money at. They're really, really complex. And that loss of faith in institutions and expectation that governments are going to be able to take care of people's needs is continuing. And at the same time, I think that there are certainly divisions happening in politics where the right and the left are becoming much more ensconced. We're seeing a replication of what we saw in the States, in other countries. We're seeing what I consider to be a bit of a threat to democracy. And I do think that the hardening of views and all of the misinformation and sources of data that I've been talking about with you guys for the last little while are coming into play, because if we don't have reliable information, if people can't sift through data and figure out what should be believed and what's not, then all of a sudden you're going to have everyone interpreting things the way that they want. And that is going to damage the structure of democracy and the Western world as we know it, and make it very difficult to have consensus on anything, because everybody is going to come forward with their scientific truth. They're going to say, this is my data and this is the truth. And they can use polls among a lot of other things to get to that point. So I do worry a lot about that. The other trend that I see happening is a lens of ESG and climate change being applied increasingly to things, especially the social and environmental aspects, and the expectation of businesses and private corporations solving problems that were previously looked to as problems of government. The expectations of organizations that are not government organizations, that are for-profit companies, to tackle these issues. And in Canada, that could also include Indigenous reconciliation, and even more broadly, identity and belonging questions. These are all, I think, things that were once seen to be the purview of government and are now seen to be the base level expectation of businesses going forward, essentially the price for entry or table stakes to engage in society. You do see some banks and some folks promoting certain types of investments that are ethical or not investing in certain areas. And you saw the other day the owner of Patagonia, he essentially gave his company to the environment. I've never seen anything like that. I'm not saying it's going to work or not. I'm not saying it's a good or a bad idea. I should probably do a poll on it. But it's new. It's a new way of thinking. And so that's one of the trends that I think is going to happen, is you're going to start to see some people looking at things in a different way based on the needs of the climate and ESG going forward. So I think that's going to be a lens you're going to see pretty much everywhere.
And so, sorry, I just want to ask, so polarizing politics, I'm sure that makes your job a lot harder, right? So for example, if you put out a poll, let's say for climate change, a lot of people, let's say on the right, might feel that, in their eyes, Ipsos does not have credibility. It's the left-wing media. If you put something out which has nuance that incorporates some of the views on the right, there may be some people on the left may thinking, you're catering to that. Like, does that make your job harder, or like maintaining that credibility, or?
No, we are neutral, and we don't take a position on these things. I've been talking to you about what the data are showing, and some of my personal views maybe have come through on what I think are going to be the challenges that lay ahead, but they're grounded in data. And political polarization actually makes my job a little bit easier, because I can use who you say you're going to vote for to predict a whole bunch of other things I think you're going to believe. We found a correlation, for example, in supporters for the convoys in Ottawa and skepticism about climate change. Now, I'm not saying that one is causing the other. It's not, but I found a correlation in that area. So I can essentially predict with some reliability that if you are skeptic about climate change, you were more likely to have supported the convoy. That polarization and that vote question helps us to divide society into more predictable ways. There is a massive amount of nuance, right? The left-wing spectrum that we've talked about for the last 200-300 years, I think is giving way to a different sort of understanding. And when I talked about that polarization, the far left and far right, as we call them, actually end up overlapping in a lot of ways on some of their more extreme views. So the political vote, or the political calculus for people, can help us to understand them in a whole bunch of other different ways. But we are a neutral arbiter. We don't do political polling for parties at all. So if I'm doing a poll on vote, it's usually for media release or for clients. We won't work for the Conservative Party or the Liberal Party, for example, because that will damage our reputation and credibility. But industry-wide, one of the big challenges for us is that, like any industry, we're only as good as our poorest performers. And when companies go out and they do these push polls and ask the bias questions, or give the impression of bias and give the impression that they're a right-wing or a left-wing polling firm, that damages all of us. And so we don't like to see that, because as an industry, we want to be known as objectives, arbiters of facts and snapshots of society in time. And there's certainly, like in any industry, some firms that are better at it than others.
Fascinating.
Yeah. I also want to go back to, so when you talked about those sort of trends that you're seeing based on your polling, the two key things that emerged was an emergence of more pessimism, or I guess a negativity about the state of where we are in society. And then you couple that with climate change, this notion of ESG. And I guess you could almost put a negative spin or lens on that as well, because when the two kind of converge, it really does, for me, what I'm hearing, demonstrate sort of a negative outlook of society. Do you see that sort of trend continuing? And is it also tied to, because what I'm seeing sometimes, I know another firm, Edelman, does this sort of trust barometer every year. And that you're seeing a downward trend towards what you had talked about as well, trust in, government institutions, societal sort of structures and so forth. Like, do you see that trend continuing really to shift? And are we ending up in this sort of negative space long term?
Yeah, I mean, we do a similar thing to Edelman, and Edelman's trust barometer it's good work. It's well respected, and we do some stuff similar on that. And yeah, I do think that the pessimism is going to continue. We have something called the Ipsos Disruption Barometer, which is a combination of socio and economic measures about current state and future state of things, and it delivers one number as an index. And right now in Canada, it's at the same level as it was at the beginning of COVID, when everybody was being told to stay home and very afraid about what this would all mean. So I do think that some of this negativity is going to persist. I think that, as I said, we had a bit of a golden age for a certain period of time in the late 20th century, and possibly we've forgotten how difficult some of these things are to manage. And we have tremendous challenges. Climate change is a wicked problem. The other trend that I'm seeing, Vasi, is that generations and the generational divide is becoming more and more pronounced. The left-wing divide or the male-female divide, you can throw the generational divide into that. And the baby boomers are retiring. They're going to start to consume all of the healthcare that they've been paying for in Canada anyway for their entire careers. There's a lot of them. And so we're going to have a work shortage, right? Because we don't have enough people to replace the baby boomers. And the younger generations, I mean, if you look at housing prices and all that, are finding it hard to get into the market. We have a massive amount of job opportunities available right now. And at the same time, these are not the jobs that are paying the wages that people need to repeat the success of their parents and grandparents. So that generational divide and that battle between, what we call Gen Y, which is the folks that are just entering the workforce, and essentially the baby boomers are their grandparents, and then Gen X is sort of the middle generation now. I do see some of this becoming a difficult thing for society to resolve. And the different generations have very, very different views on a number of things. Climate change is a tremendous example. The younger generation is much more concerned, much more wanting us to take quick action than the older generation, but there's others as well. So we look a lot at that demographic break between the generations, and I think that's going to be something that is going to be a continued preoccupation for governments and for companies as they look for workers to replace the retiring baby boomers, who, as I said, are now going to start to really consume a lot more healthcare dollars and become net consumers of government services instead of net contributors as taxpayers. Did that answer your question, or did I go off a little bit on that one?
No, that actually was really good, because I put the banner on and you touched upon about 3 or 4 different trends. So that was really good. Yeah. Good.
Vasi, did we cover the last couple of questions, or no?
Which ones I'm looking, yeah. No, we talked about technological trends. We did the AI part. I'm just looking. I had about future trends, state of society. I mean, I have a question that says, looking at larger data sets, are there issues and topics you feel that we are missing as a society? Do we maybe want to touch upon that? Do you want me to frame that, or?
Sure.
Okay. Okay. All right. So I've got that. So, okay, I'll start. So Greg, looking at large data sets, and you have access to that, are there issues or maybe trends that you think from the data we're missing from a societal standpoint, that from a future perspective, they're important to focus on for us?
Yeah, I that's a great question. I think I touched a little bit on this already, but the one thing I want to reemphasize is that rapid change that's happening and how quickly data are being generated and how quickly things are changing. And that means opinions as well. And you look at the last 3 years, because we had COVID, that was a transformational event, a once in a lifetime kind of event, hopefully, for us to go through. And so that almost led to a bit of a reset in some of people's values and beliefs. And we have a procedure at Ipsos. It's called segmentation. It's a statistical procedure where we put the population into segments or groups. And these groups usually don't change. They're values based. This is where you kind of sit. You can move within the segment a bit, but generally you're not going to shift out of it. Well, in the last 3 years, because of COVID, we did see some shifts because people started to reevaluate what was important to them, reevaluate the future of their work, reevaluate the things that they took for granted. Like, I never imagined, for example, myself, that there would be provincial border controls up in Canada. I thought that would be impossible. I never imagined the government telling me that you can't stand in your backyard with your neighbor. And these are suddenly things that are possible. And so I think that all of the polling we've done, and we have a massive, obviously, data set on research that was done throughout COVID and as we emerge from it, does suggest that some of these fundamental values might be shifting. Some of the expectations people have might be shifting. And they're rethinking things that they would not have rethought had they not gone through COVID. And we don't have data on this yet, but I guarantee you it's going to be something that's going to be interesting in 15 to 20 years, are the kids who only know the post-COVID era. How are they going to change? How is it going to change how they grow up? Even, this is an anecdotal example. It's not one based in data, but a friend of mine during COVID had a baby and didn't bring the baby out for car rides because they weren't going anywhere. Well, now the kid is 2 years old and is terrified of cars because they didn't have that experience. Yes. So we don't know the answers to this, but
I've had similar examples where parents haven't, because of COVID, socialized their babies, and when they do meet people now, they sort of are taken aback or overwhelmed by social settings. Yeah. Absolutely. And you see that impact across the board. And I don't think, even as a society 2 years ago, this notion of how we work, this idea of remote work, and I want to now have flexibility and work wherever I want to work, was even a trend or an issue. It was sort of, we all went in, we did our job, and maybe for the majority of us did something 9 to 5, or you go in and do your shift. And so to your point, I've seen a dramatic shift from the start of the pandemic to now, almost to the end of 2022. And I'm very fascinated to see where these opinions really, for me, end up long term.
Yeah, and I can tie this right back to where we started, which is, why is polling important? Why is this work important? It's because we can measure the differences and changes in these things as they start to happen. And you are absolutely right. There's a bunch of examples of how this has affected people. Future of work, no, people weren't, and I know because I have polling data on it. When you ask people, do you work from home? The number who said I work from home has dramatically increased. Now, we all kind of know that anecdotally, but it's no surprise that a lot of people work from home during COVID. And now a lot of them are saying, I kind of like it. I want to keep working from home. Companies are rethinking how they're going to accommodate some of those employees. And some of that generation stuff that I talked about earlier comes into play. So the large, what we call longitudinal data sets that measure the same thing over time, trend lines, are going to be invaluable as we move through the post-COVID era. And answer some of the questions that we don't have answers to yet. And one of the challenges I have as a pollster is to anticipate what those questions are going to be, so I can start asking about them now and have a better answer, in 5 years when some things become a little more clear.
Right. Perfect.
So this has been a very interesting conversation, Greg. I mean, from my end, again, it's not a field that you think of on a daily basis. So when we sit down with someone and, sit through some of the challenges and some of the trends, at least for me, it's always a great learning experience, and I'm sure our listeners would always enjoy. Before we end, ask a couple of questions, some fun questions. And one, is there a book that you've read or that you would recommend to our listeners? I actually have a Twitter thread going around with all the recommendations with all of our
guests.
Oh, great.
It makes for a fascinating.
You can actually, if you're interested, we can send you. You can see what everybody else has actually answered as well. So
I'd love to see that. That would be very cool. Yeah.
Awesome.
Do you want to frame the question, or do you want me to just answer it?
No, that's fine. So one is a book that you've read or you would recommend. Secondly, is there a movie that you've seen that you would recommend? And third, a TV show.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
So I definitely have a book I would recommend. It's a book by a guy named Vaclav Smil. He is a professor in Manitoba, and he's an energy expert. And I didn't touch on this, but the future of energy is an area that I think is tied completely to the climate change debate. You can't talk about climate change without talking about energy. And this guy is an expert at this stuff. And he has a book called How the World Really Works, which literally explains how the world really works and the impacts on energy, but it does it in a layman's term, easy to understand kind of way that I think anybody could grasp. It's not a technical book. It's got some fascinating data, and it shows you what a wicked problem climate change really is, and how difficult it is for us to transition to a new source of energy from fossil fuels, which is what a lot of governments have declared their goal to be. So I highly recommend this book and anything else by that same author. TV shows, I've been watching a few shows recently. There's a show on Apple TV called For All Mankind, which I think is a great show because it imagines a future that is different than ours, and it imagines a future where the Soviets had landed on the moon before we did. And this is important for my area of work because that's one of the things I'm doing is imagining a future based on what people think or what data show. So in this show, technology advanced at a much faster rate than it would have because the Americans are trying to keep up with the Soviets. And I find it a really entertaining show, and I like the idea of imagining different possible futures based on one small change that you might not necessarily have even expected. And then book-wise, a recent book that I read, which is similar to the TV show For All Mankind, is a book called All Our Wrong Todays by a Canadian author. His name is Ilan Mastre. And it too is about sort of a different possible future. And it talks about what if we had invented some sort of energy source in the 1950s that was non-emitting and perpetual, right? How would the world be different? And it explores a lot of the different areas that I think relate to some of the challenges I mentioned earlier around equality and society evolving, and whether or not we had this golden age in the 20th century that is coming to an end. But ultimately, it's a really good book. There's some time travel in there if you're into sci-fi, so that's kind of important. And it's a Canadian book, so I recommend that. I hope one day they turn this into a movie or a television show.
So Greg, thank you so much, Vice President of Ipsos Canada. This was our episode on the future of polling.
Thank you for joining us today, Greg, and we hope to have you back sometime in the future.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Greg.